So today we're going to talk about pediatric clinical research, and we're not going to get into the sort of extreme nuts and bolts of it, but really what I want you to take away is sort of the idea of, or the reasons why we do clinical research and the principles that guide clinical research. So there's going to be a little bit of ethics, a little bit of case reviews of interesting things, and then we'll focus toward the end a little bit on informed consent, and sort of your take-home is hopefully how to perform and understand a better informed consent process. So I have no disclosures commercially related to the content, although I do spend about 2/3 of my time in research. Half of that is actually in clinical trials. I seek to discover truths, and despite all those things, I sometimes wear my emotions on my sleeves. My clinical trials are supported by pharma and NIH, at least half a dozen active current studies, and probably 30 over the past 5 or 6 years. So our clinical trial repertoire has been fairly broad. So today we want to talk about the importance of clinical research, some of the safety aspects, and identify some of the key components of a valid informed consent process. And I'd like to start out with this short video, which will take about an hour, and then and then after that we'll do something useful. How about that? So bear with. Let's see if we can get the lights down low. Let's see what I can do here. Is that all right? Is it too loud back there? Okay. Okay.
Hi, my name is Andrew and I am 9 years old.
My name is Emma and I'm 7 years old.
My name is Grant and I'm 8 years old.
My name is Alexis and I'm 11 years old.
Hi, my name is Addison and I'm 8 years old. My name is Sophie and I'm 5 years old.
What was the toughest decision you had to make today?
Waking up or not waking up?
I have no idea.
I had to choose to put my hair in braids. I know.
What do you do for a living?
I do chores.
I play soccer, I guess, and I play video games.
I do tap.
It's sort of a little weird if you're 9 years old and you have a job.
I don't know.
If you have to drive to the hospital, do you know the fastest route?
No, I don't. Well, no, my mom drives me.
Because I don't have a license and I'm not 16.
And don't have a driver's license.
I don't know.
When you're not feeling well, do you prefer acetaminophen or ibuprofen?
What's that?
What?
Huh?
What's that?
I know.
Would you consider participating in a clinical trial?
It might be like...
I don't know.
Why do you think you need an adult to make decisions for you?
Because I'm too little.
Maybe because I haven't graduated from college or I'm not old enough.
Because I'm not like old enough, like when I want to have a sleepover, they have to make the decision of whether I can or whether I can't.
If I don't know what to do, she can sometimes tell me answers to help me.
Because she's smart and she passed college and she knows this stuff.
It's my mom's job to take care of me. I'm not old enough.
I know my mom will make the right choices for me.
My name is Heather, and this is my daughter, Della.
My name is Amanda, and this is Abby.
My name is Heather, and this is Alex.
My name is Nevaeh, and this is my dad, James.
Well, Nevaeh, she had a kidney transplant at just over 2 years of age, and she had gotten sick in 2011. And when that happened, at the time, there really wasn't anything out there that could, really help the situation.
So about a year ago, Alexander was sick in the hospital. He had sickle cell pain crisis, and he also had infection. And we were being treated with antibiotics, and that's when we were approached about doing a study.
They were doing a clinical trial on a particular drug for another purpose, but Dr. Vanchiere had found out about Nevaeh and her case through Nevaeh's doctor, Dr. Reisman. So he talked to my wife and talked to me and asked us if we would be willing to try it to see if it would help her out.
When you are faced with life and death decisions, you will do anything you can to make sure that your child is going to survive.
What exactly are you asking of me? You don't know, what is this medication? What does it do? That's, important because you don't know what kind of side effects it's going to have, on your child. So that's mainly what you want to know. You don't want any bad side effects.
You have that, caution because it is a clinical drug, and you almost feel like maybe she's a guinea pig in a sense.
I didn't want him to be a guinea pig.
Because it's something that they're trying out.
But after they talked to me and gave me all the information, then we knew that it was the right choice for us.
We're lucky that Della's type of leukemia has a 94% cure rate. But without people participating in the clinical research trials, we wouldn't be where we are today.
We agreed to it, and he pushed the proper procedures and process through to get her approved for it, and it all got approved, and we went through with the whole clinical trial.
And so, for a couple weeks, I don't know if it was exactly how long, but I know it was for several weeks, he had to take the drug, and then they would come and they would draw labs on him, and they would record, how the medication made him feel, if there was any side effects or whatever, and then we'd come and do labs, and then that was it.
And it worked for us. It took care of the virus that she had, and it served its purpose.
We're currently in Protocol 16. The things that they have found in the last Protocol 15, they were able to change for Protocol 16.
The clinical trial seemed like a more progressive way of fighting Abby's cancer.
The science is moving so quickly that we're seeing the results of the research in real time.
Not only is this helping Alex, but potentially it's helping thousands of other kids out there.
What we learned with even just a short clinical trial for one individual, you would hope and expect that somewhere down the road it helps somebody else and help push something else forward to really making a breakthrough.
Anytime we're asked to participate in research, it's an automatic yes. Because we know that the data collected from Della and her participating is going to affect generations to come.
It's because of people that have been participating in this research for the past 30 years that Abby is alive today. It all happened really fast. In the month leading up to her diagnosis, we didn't really notice anything out of the ordinary. She had some bruising and she had an upset stomach and came home from school once or twice, but it didn't really seem anything out of the ordinary. She was in gymnastics, and so the bruising we just figured was due to the bumping around, hitting the beam and the bars, and just being a normal kid. And then there was the car accident. It wasn't really a bad accident, but she was still complaining about it hurting, so we thought we should get it checked out. We took her to see the pediatrician, and he noticed she looked kind of pale, so he wanted to do some more tests, and they drew some blood work. Well, after they drew the blood work, we were sitting in the room waiting, and he came in and said that their machine wasn't working, and he wanted to run the lab test again. So they drew some more blood and ran the test again. And he came back again and said that it still wasn't working right, and they wanted to send her blood off to another lab to have it checked. Then the pediatrician called and said we needed to go to the hospital immediately. When we showed up at the hospital, they already had a bed waiting for Abby. They had more tests lined up. The doctor pulled me out of the room and told me that Abby had cancer. And at that point, I really didn't know what to think. It was not what I was expecting. Abby has acute lymphoblastic leukemia, the T-cell variety, which is the more rare and more aggressive form of those two types. We were given the option of getting treated locally or doing a clinical trial. It's a choice that I never thought I would be making. Because of people that have been participating in this research for the past 30 years that Abby is alive today. I know Abby's participation is going to contribute to the next 30 years of more children being saved. The family of clinical research gets stronger every day. And it's a family we're proud to be a part of.
I am why we search. We are why we search. I am why we search. I am why we search.
This is why we search.
This may be a crazy concept, but children are not little adults. When it comes to appropriate medications for children, you can't just cut a medication in half and say, well, they're half the size of an adult, they need half the amount of medicine. It turns out kids actually metabolize a lot of medicines much more quickly than adults. What I do and what I focus my career on is developing and bringing to children new strategies for healthcare, new medications, vaccines, treatments that have not previously been available. They may be available in the adult population, but we have to determine how is the best way to use those for children.
During my time in the pediatric intensive care unit, up to 90% of the drugs that we used in these fragile children had never been through a randomized clinical trial.
I'm a second-generation pediatrician. What I do every day is a lot different than what my father used to do.
To me, a research nurse is someone who helps benefit people in the future. It's not just regular nursing care every day, taking care of your patients and then going home. It's something that will last, something that will benefit those who come after us.
I've been involved in clinical research for many years. As a fellow during my training, I got involved in working on a couple of clinical trials and knew that it was something that I had a personal interest in and saw as so important with our population.
To me, research is about improving the health of children in generations to come.
One of the most exciting things about pediatrics is that children are healthier than they've ever been in human history. We have defied evolution in incredible ways in the past 100 years.
We certainly have come a long way, especially over the last maybe 10 years, but we still have a long way to go. So we're forming a group designed to fix that. The Pediatric Collaboration Team is a cross-functional team with representatives from the entire continuum of pediatric research and pediatric clinical trial design and implementation. The expertise that our team brings is one part of it. The other part of it, as important if not more so, is finding the right sites to do the pediatric research. Do they have the proper equipment, again, that's made for pediatric populations? Do they have things for children to play with that distract them? Is there a room where a sibling might be able to come?
In the clinical research world, we're a site for clinical trials. But in the real world, we're a place where patients come to have access to life-saving treatments.
It's really all about relationships.
Being a successful clinical trial site is all about relationships.
Relationships are one of the most important reasons that I am involved in research. I value the relationship that I develop with the caregivers, the parents, and the children.
And every time we get a new patient or participant, we're just growing our family.
One of the most difficult aspects of pediatric clinical trials is talking with parents about making sometimes tough decisions for their children.
Sometimes caregivers have to make tough decisions when it comes to the care of their child.
And helping parents understand that our goal is the same as theirs, to make the best clinical decisions for their children.
It's our job as researchers to help lead these people in the right direction of what's best for their child.
It's why I do what I do.
There are many reasons why we do research, and their names are Ava, and Cody, and Annabeth, and Tredarius, and Landry, and the hundreds and thousands of other children in our nation and our world who suffer from diseases that we don't understand. And it's the search for answers for them and for their parents. They're the reason we do research every day.
Okay, so that's a little introduction to clinical research and some of the reasons why we do clinical research and some of what we do around here. Two of the stars of the show are here. Lisa Latchley and Molly Linville are two research nurses in the Children's Clinical Research Center, and they are my right and left hand when it comes to clinical trials research. And I think part of the reason I wanted to show you this video is because it, I hope, kind of crystallizes a major reason why we do clinical research. And what's different about an academic health science center where you are in training or in practice is that we offer research to life-saving and medications that are not available in the general population yet. We're pushing the envelope to help expand the options for care for children. So we'll go back first to some of the old literature. And what does Hippocrates say? He says the physician must be able to tell the antecedents, know the present, foretell the future, mediate these things, and have two special objects in view with regard to disease, namely to do good or to do no harm. And this is a very challenging thing. Of course, we should know the present by our physical exam, the antecedents by the history, foretell the future, that's a little tougher. We can sometimes tell what we expect to happen, but patients don't read the textbook very much. And here we have a really difficult challenge, to do good or to do no harm. In our modern world, the expectation is that we will do good and do no harm. And so our society is now holding us to a much taller order when it comes to the care we provide for our patients and in the research we do. And this underlying principle, do good or do no harm, clearly applies to research as well as clinical medicine. So here's a very interesting study. We'll start historically. This is 1880, published in the precursor to the New England Journal of Medicine. And this was a study of vaccination. It says intrauterine vaccination. It wasn't actually intrauterine. But these were 28 moms who were revaccinated against smallpox during their pregnancy, which would never happen today, right? Right, absolutely not. There are only two vaccines we recommend during pregnancy, right? Students, what are they? Flu and Tdap, right, for pertussis especially, okay? So here is, and then in this, 8 children were available for follow-up, so that's not a very good follow-up rate, 8 out of 28. 4 of the children of moms who had successful vaccination had no response to the smallpox. That is to say, mom had a smallpox take, developed the appropriate rash at her arm, and then her children didn't respond to the vaccine for 4 children. 2 of the moms who had a partial vaccination had also no response, and 2 children whose moms had unsuccessful vaccination. 1, the child was vaccinated successful, and 1 was a failure. So we got to think about, well, what is this guy trying to prove in the first place? And any thoughts there? What's he trying to prove? What's he looking for here? Right, he's looking at whether maternal immunity impacts the uptake or the production of infant immunity. Okay, and very important questions. It's part of the reason that we use measles vaccine now at 12 months of age rather than earlier for general purposes, is because mom's antibodies actually interfere with the production of antibodies against measles if given when mom's antibody titers are high. But this is an example of the type of research that could never happen now. In this case, there was no obvious, clear oversight of the research by an institutional review board, much less a broader societal ethics committee or a Food and Drug Administration-like kind of thing. So there have been in the past a lot of things that have happened that clearly wouldn't happen today. So how do we define research? The common rule, which is part of the Code of Federal Regulations, define research as a systematic investigation, and this includes all things about research, including development, testing, evaluation, designed, and the goal is here, designed to develop or contribute to generalized knowledge. So in terms of examples of systematic investigations, the important one we're going to talk about today is clinical trials, but all of these fall into the category of systematic investigations. Analysis of data and data banks, so retrospective chart studies, surveys and questionnaires, interviews and focus groups, and then even larger epidemiologic studies. The importance with respect to clinical trials research is that oftentimes we're using investigational drugs or devices, and the principles by which we undertake the research are what we're going to focus on next. So here's an example of in vitro activity of ceftaroline against MRSA and different strains of Staph aureus. This is not considered clinical research, okay? Because it's studying bacteria in a test tube, right? It doesn't involve people or interventions of any kind. Here, an interesting case report, eradication of adenovirus in a pediatric stem cell transplant recipient using a novel viral agent, CMX001. This is the same drug that the little girl Nevaeh in the video got here to help treat her BK nephropathy after her kidney transplant. So would this be considered clinical research? I see some yes, I see some no. In fact, it's not. It's a case report, and case reports are not considered clinical research. It's an N of 1, and it's not designed to contribute to generalizable knowledge. So this doesn't fall into the category of research. However, it's absolutely critical that case reports like this be published. And we encourage all the faculty and especially the medical students that when you have interesting cases, like we have many of in infectious diseases, translate those into case reports, because it's those observations that become the rationale for developing new trials and new studies in both basic and clinical research. Okay, so these kind of investigations really set the stage, or not investigations, reports set the stage for designing clinical trials in the future. And Nevaeh's case was also published in a similar way. This little graphic is interesting. You can see the adenovirus viral load going up, and here's when the girl, young patient, started the medication, and her adenovirus titers came down dramatically, and when they blipped again, they gave her another course of drug. Very, very provocative data, but an N of 1 means you got to do something else with it. Okay? Here is an interesting graphic that most of you will not have ever seen. These are the lines of people outside the San Antonio Convention Center waiting to get their smallpox vaccines in the 1950s, so much before all of your times. Some of your parents' times too. So is this clinical research? No, because the drug was already approved by the FDA. It had already been gone through clinical trials. Okay, and so once it's FDA approved, then in general you don't have to do clinical trials afterward. There are what we call post-marketing trials, or phase 4 studies, to capture more safety data. So a good example might be a flu vaccine that we're using currently. I'm on a safety board to look at the safety of that flu vaccine when used in pregnant women. And that's a requirement of the FDA to look at long-term follow-up in special situations. Okay? But once a drug is approved, it's open to the masses, and pretty much any physician with the pharmacy license to prescribe can prescribe it. Most of us would be really hesitant to prescribe chemotherapy because it's not within our realm of scope of practice, but all of us prescribe antibiotics very frequently because they're well within the scope of practice for all pediatricians. So why do we embark on research? The video talked a lot about some of these. We really search for truth, the beauty of creation. We hunt for understanding, and we really have the spark of designing something new and tackling difficult clinical problems. There are lots of reasons, and they were partly enumerated there. This is my niece, Annabeth. Annabeth's my godchild, and some of you have seen these pictures before. This is Annabeth when she was about 4. Here she is at age 6, and you can see she's in a wheelchair now and has supplemental oxygen on. When Annabeth was 2, she began to lose her developmental milestones, and her speech stopped progressing, and her physical abilities, she lost her ability to stand. She never really walked fully. And at 2, she was diagnosed with a mitochondrial disease. And the neurologist was a very seasoned neurologist, and he told Annabeth's parents, my brother and his wife, that Annabeth had a mitochondrial disease. The MRI, was indicative of that, and that her life expectancy was about 5 years. And and that there were no drugs available or no clinical trials at the time available to help Annabeth. And so they should come back every year because something might develop in the years to come. Annabeth's now 10, so she's defied his prediction of her life expectancy. And there were several clinical trials that came available for kids with mitochondrial diseases. What was fascinating over the past 10 years, what we've seen, is that Annabeth initially could not be in the clinical trials because the FDA required that kids with mitochondrial disease actually have a molecular diagnosis. And so even though Annabeth's entire mitochondrial genome had been sequenced and the cellular proteins that are part of the mitochondrial cascades had been sequenced, and there was no obvious mutation that indicated a mitochondrial disorder, she couldn't be in the clinical trials because the clinical diagnosis was not good enough. It had to be molecular. And with the work of advocacy in the Mitochondrial Disease Foundation, that the FDA was pushed really hard, and they changed that standard because it was really too stringent for kids like Annabeth who have no options, who have a very shortened life expectancy, and for her parents, no hope that anything else will come available. Okay? So with advocacy is another part of clinical trials that is important, and there are numerous examples where drugs are pulled from the market, but yet a special population petitions and says, hey, we accept the risk of using this drug, and we move forward. So now Annabeth is, like I said, she's 10. She still goes to school most days. She's 100% wheelchair bound. Requires a lot more support than she used to. Has a G button for feeding. But she's an inspiration for me, even though I don't even work in her field, in the area that could benefit her. I end up doing a lot of consulting for her family. What are the challenges to clinical research? Less funding overall, writing grants, well, yeah, those are part of the package. There's increasing oversight from the FDA, NIH, the Human Research Protection Program, and the IRB. And the pendulum typically has swung to a fairly conservative nature, and it varies at different institutions. But overall, the bottom line is that there's an increasing bureaucracy. We have lots of training requirements. Every trial we take on has new requirements for this or that training, either in the computer aspects of it or regulatory aspects. As clinicians, we have busy clinical services, and we also have teaching responsibilities, and protecting our faculty time, especially in the era of RVUs for research, is very difficult because there are no RVUs for research. And so, I have the great benefit, and I always give thanks to Dr. Bocchini for protecting me to bring clinical research to our department. So what are the principles and benchmarks of what we do? As the video indicated, this is collaborative partnership. We build teams. The research must have some social value in general, and most importantly, scientific validity. We want fair participant selection, and we'll talk about some of the ethical principles. Favorable risk-benefit ratio. We don't want to put people in harm's way when they're not going to potentially benefit from it. Independent review by the IRB and by the FDA. Informed consent is a major part of that, and that follows from our respect for our participants and their families. A lot of documents over time have influenced our bioethics, starting really with, long time ago, Code of Hammurabi and other things, Hippocrates, but the Nuremberg Code after World War II was one of the first to really enumerate what are the principles of ethical research, and that was based on the part of the rationale or the defense by German doctors who had performed horribly unethical research during World War II is, well, there are no standards and there are no laws against it. And so therefore they felt it was okay to do. And in the United States, we go back and point to the Belmont Report, a very short report that very specifically codifies three things: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice as the three hallmark principles. And then the Code of Federal Regulations now defines what are the statutory requirements for protection of subjects and IRBs and functions and others. And then there are international standards, again, that go back to this Declaration of Helsinki and have been revised numerous times. So in the Belmont Report, there are these three principles: the respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. We'll highlight each of those briefly. Respect for persons really means things like obtaining informed consent, considering privacy, confidentiality, adding protections for vulnerable populations, and pediatric patients are always considered a vulnerable population, partly because they're not making the decision themselves. Their parents are making the decision. Prisoners are a particularly vulnerable population. It's not ethical to do research on prisoners that actually doesn't benefit the prisoners themselves. Okay? In prior experiences in parts of the world, prisoners were frequently experimented on in very horrific ways. The mentally challenged are also a vulnerable population. Pregnant women are also considered a vulnerable population and have to have special protections built into the clinical trials. And really the goal here is that individuals should be treated as autonomous agents afforded the right to make decisions themselves. Now, as clinicians, physicians, and trainees, the pendulum has swung so far now to avoiding paternalism. That is to say, a lot of physicians will lay out for their patients, well, you could do this, 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 or nothing. What do you want to do? And that, while it gives the patient full autonomy and maybe relieves us of any responsibility, it's really not the best way to have a patient make a decision. The best way is what we would call an informed consent process, a discussion. Really, the way I put it with parents when I sit down with them is that this is not a decision that they're going to be forced to make. It's a decision we'll make together based on what their values are and the goals of either the research study or the drug we're going to attempt to use for their child. And that's really the best way to make decisions about clinical research and clinical practice. Beneficence is really ensuring that the possible benefits are maximal and the risks are minimized. And that's really about risk-benefit ratio. We want to make sure that there are benefits either to the subject or to society in general, at the very least, that outweigh any harms or potential harms. So the risk-benefit analysis, we always go through, and that must really favor the subjects or at least be neutral for the subjects. And we have to consider not just what could happen, patient could die, but the probability of it happening. And here's another place where, as physicians and pediatricians especially, with respect to, say, vaccines, we have traditionally failed. It's easy to sell the meningococcal vaccine, right? Show them a picture of teenagers with no arms and legs, and they say, I want that for my child. But the likelihood of that happening is less than 1 in a million. Advance to the other side of the coin, look at human papillomavirus-associated disease, very common, very likely to happen, but we tend to brush it off and say, well, most people cure themselves, their immune system takes care of this, and the likelihood that you're going to have cancer related to HPV is relatively low. That's a true statement. But it's a very common disease and a common killer in Louisiana especially. So we have to talk about not just what could happen, but what the likelihood of it happening is to give enough information to make an informed decision. And then justice is related to the equitable selection of subjects. We want to study subjects who are going to benefit from the drugs that we're studying in the clinical trial. If we do, as traditionally done, a study of atherosclerotic disease and HMG-CoA reductase inhibitors in only white middle-aged men, well, does that tell us anything about the effects or the efficacy of these drugs in women or African Americans or Asians or anybody else, right? No. So we have to make sure that there is equitable selection of subjects across the board. And now we have very close scrutiny of the enrollment process and really the inclusion and exclusion criteria of the studies to make sure that the people who are going to benefit are the ones being studied. That's also part of the reason that we don't do, and in the United States, it's very frowned upon to do what I call hit-and-run research. Well, if you want to study an HIV vaccine, you just go to Africa, do a study in people who are at high risk, and then you come back and sell the vaccine here, but don't make it available to them, or a drug or other things, right? So we want to make sure that we're appropriately utilizing the drugs and vaccines and other things where they're going to be used in society. But we have these balancing acts. How do we balance the benefit to our patients and the cost to society? That always goes back to even just prescribing antibiotics. Sometimes antibiotics are more harmful than they are good. How do we balance the current risk to our patients and the future risk to society? We use antibiotics now to save our patients' lives, but we consume those antibiotics and have resistant organisms in the future that do more harm. We have to think about that. That's part of our antibiotic stewardship. How do we balance the rights of the patient to make an informed decision against the potential benefit to society of alternative therapies? Very complex things. Trying to explain to a parent the difference between chemotherapeutic regimen A and chemotherapeutic regimen A plus new drug is very complex. And having a consent form that is 23, 30, 50 pages long means, yikes. People are going to say, if there's that much information I have to worry about, I'm not interested, period. Right? So we have to be ready to balance these things. And really, does do no harm apply only to our present patient, or does it have some inherent obligation to protect our future patients in our society? So go back to the question of antibiotic stewardship. So a few specific examples. Walter Reed, he's a physician from the late 1800s, early 1900s. He's named after a famous military hospital. And Walter Reed was interested in studying transmission of yellow fever. And the question that he addressed was, is this bloodborne or mosquito-borne? So he recruited, quote unquote, 18 Americans and 15 Spanish immigrants who were exposed to loaded mosquitoes or subcutaneous injections of blood. Some of these recruits slept in bed linens that were covered in the blood and vomit of people who died of yellow fever. Yikes. And really, he set up 2 houses with screens around them, and one had mosquitoes in it with yellow fever, and there were a few patients, and the other had no mosquitoes, but these bed linens that the people slept on. Ugh, horrific, right? And we say, yeah, that would never happen today. It shouldn't happen today, right? What Walter Reed brought to the equation was that he actually used an informed consent process. And so he had documents that were in the form of a contract between individual volunteers and his commission, which is the research commission. Each volunteer had to be at least 25 years old and had to explicitly consent to participate. And what the subjects really had to do was balance their risk of almost certainty of getting yellow fever, because they were in Puerto Rico, versus, and in the general population, versus the risk of getting it in the study and having access to the best supportive care available. Tough decision. If you're 100% certain you're going to get yellow fever out there, would you rather get yellow fever in here? And the answer for most of them was yes. Volunteers agreed to remain in camp for the duration of the experiments, and as a reward for participation, they received $100 in American gold, with an additional $100 supplement if they actually got sick. And the payments could be assigned to a survivor, and the volunteers agreed to forfeit any remuneration if they deserted, so if they left early. And actually, Walter Reed guaranteed that if they died of yellow fever, he would make sure their family got the $200, right? So this is really the beginning of modern informed consent, of a study that, yeah, we still would be hard-pressed to do today. We're doing similar studies. We're doing studies where we intentionally infect people with RSV, or not yet Zika virus, but West Nile virus, other things like that, because we know they're not likely to die of those viruses. But Walter Reed really began to crystallize an informed consent process. So he gets positive credit for that, even though the study was a little ooky. Could it have been approved by an IRB? It probably was approvable at that time, but not now. But I still wouldn't sleep in bloody, vomitous, covered linens, people who died of yellow fever. Okay. Advance now to the 1990s, I believe the Gelsinger case. This is from University of Pennsylvania. And this treatment that was offered to Jesse Gelsinger was an adenovirus-mediated gene transfer to correct partial ornithine transcarbamylate deficiency. It's a phase 1 study. It enrolled 18 subjects. The adenovirus vector was non-replicating, so it would deliver the goods but shouldn't cause any problem. It enrolled adults with mild disease. And Jesse actually had a mosaic form of OTC deficiency and a unique mutation. He had several episodes of hyperammonemia prior to his 18th birthday, but he was 18 years of age at the time. Consented to be in the trial. 18 hours after the infusion, he developed altered mental status and jaundice, systemic inflammatory response syndrome, DIC, multi-organ failure, ARDS, and he died 98 hours after the gene transfer due to fulminant immune reaction to the adenovirus vector. James Wilson was the principal investigator on the study. He actually owned the patents for the drug and was a co-owner of the sponsoring company Genovo. And the outcome of this trial actually set back gene therapy at least 10 to 15 years because this was so poorly done. The issues identified in the FDA investigation, Gelsinger was actually a substitute for another volunteer who dropped out, and despite having high ammonia levels, it should have led to his exclusion. So he didn't meet the exclusion criteria. Failure by the university to report that 2 patients had experienced serious side effects from the gene therapy. Those should have been reported to the IRB. Trial halted until they could be reviewed before somebody else could be enrolled. And finally, failure to disclose in the informed consent documentation that 2 monkeys who given a similar treatment had died. Does that seem relevant? Seems relevant to me. My child's not a monkey, but yeah, if monkeys are bumped off by this, then you have to be worried that humans might be also. So this really was an unfortunate event and a storm of events that we hope is not going to happen again. Unfortunately, some things continue to happen. And so there's been a lot to review, and following the money is a big part of it because Dr. Wilson was clearly operating in murky waters, walking on eggshells. Advance forward just to last fall. And here's new data about a herpes virus vaccine. This is fascinating. 3 years before they launched an offshore herpes vaccine trial, that is, you can be tested in the United States, and if you qualify and you have herpes virus infection, you can go to St. Kitts. They'll pay for your travel to go there to be in a herpes vaccine trial. An American researcher at Southern Illinois University, a PhD scientist, had vaccinated patients in U.S. hotel rooms in violation of U.S. law. And SIU professor, this is him, William Halford, administered the shots himself at a Holiday Inn Express and Crown Plaza Hotel. 15-minute drive from his laboratory. He injected at least 8 patients on 4 separate occasions, summer or fall of 2013. And no IRB oversight, no institutional approval, no FDA regulation, etc. No even physician or nurse practitioner involved in the conduct of this investigation. According to emails between Dr. Halford and the patients and extensive interviews, there was no informed written consent as required by federal law, especially when testing a live virus on humans. And it's clear, researchers are not allowed to inject patients without oversight by a physician or nurse practitioner. So this is current news. This is reported just last fall. If you go to the website of the company that this guy founded, it's called Rational Vaccines, and it has a portfolio for investors and information about how you can participate in their trials and the safety of their vaccine in the studies done in St. Kitts. And currently they stand by their vaccine and are trying to move it into the United States and say, well, yeah, we may have had some ethical lapses in the past, but the fact is it's safe and needs to be studied better and more in the United States. So this kind of thing happens, scarily, in hotel rooms. live virus vaccines out of a laboratory, unregulated. Purification process, quality control, we have no clue, right? All right, so then we get back to informed consent. This doctor is telling the patient, the cure to your disease came from stem cell research. Sign here if you wish to refuse treatment for moral, religious, or ideological reasons. There are a lot of patients who have now begun to refuse vaccines for various reasons, including religious objections, although no major institutionalized religion in the world has a prohibition against vaccines. So that includes Catholicism, Buddhism, Hindu, Muslim. None of these have prohibitions against the use of vaccines. So what is informed consent, and what does it look like in practice? How does it differ from consent for treatment? So here's your audience participation. Let's see, students, have you been on surgery rotation? What does informed consent for surgery look like, guys?
Tell them what you think is going to happen, and what are the outcomes, what can happen poorly.
All right. So it's a brief process that includes discussing what is expected to happen, what could happen, what shouldn't happen, and sign here. Fairly brief, right? And sometimes it's, resident, go get consent on this patient even though you've never seen them before, right? So there's oftentimes no pre-existing relationship between doctor and patient. That's problematic. The surgeon who is doing the surgery, ideally, should be the one getting consent. The same is true for anesthesia. The same is true in clinical trials, that I believe. The PI, the principal investigator, or physician, especially for an intervention study, should be the one getting consent, not a nurse. So what it really should look like in clinical practice is a discussion, a decision together, the physician or person obtaining consent, sitting down, talking to the patient face to face, not like going in on rounds, standing, looking down at the patient, all those things, quick, you're out of there. No, it is a process. The paper that we sign is merely a documentation of the process. But the process itself is the most important. It's the relationship, and it necessarily includes not just what could happen and what shouldn't happen, but those data on the probability of those outcomes potentially occurring. And it's different from consent for treatment. I mean, every patient signs a consent for treatment when they enter the hospital, right? Does that give us license to do anything and everything in the hospital? No, it doesn't. We have to have specific consents for LPs and procedures and other things like that. But a consent for treatment, the general broad consent for treatment to the hospital, does not apply in this case. That's just really saying you're entering the hospital knowing that you're saying you want care and we'll care for you. But the consent for treatment or any of those going to specific procedures really should be a true informed consent process. Quality improvement projects are part of this bailiwick now, and most residents are, in lots of programs, are required to do quality improvement projects. And the goal here is to measurably improve patient outcomes that are clinically meaningful, improving health, gaining efficiency, reducing costs, all of which are good rationales for quality improvement projects. And the reiterative study of practices and outcomes is a major part of that. It's now a requirement for our maintenance of certification in pediatrics and our subspecialties. Here's a good example of that. The Department of Health several years ago published this data. On the left is a heat map of the preterm birth rates, showing that Northwest Louisiana has the highest preterm birth rates. And on the right is a heat map of uptake of a drug called 17P. 17P is a progesterone derivative given during pregnancy to help prevent preterm births. And this indicates that the middle and south Louisiana have much higher uptake of this drug, correlating with their low prematurity rates compared to our poor uptake of the drug and our high prematurity rates. But the important thing here is you've got to ask, what's the source of this data? And is it verifiable data? And what they were looking at really was billing codes. How many times were patients being billed or insurance being billed on behalf of a patient for receipt of this drug? And that's not a great way to actually look at the use of the drug. And when the OB resident took on this challenge and said, I don't believe that because we use 17p all the time. What she found in a specific case review is our use of 17p was just as high as everybody else's and right on par with where it should be. And that's a really good QI project to show we're doing what we should do, we can do it better, and this is how. And importantly, association is not really causation. You've got to be skeptical of the data and ask deeper questions. Okay, so we're almost to the end. Here's one of my favorite quotes from a Harvard professor of anatomy in 1899. Oops. The born investigator no more needs encouragement to investigate than the fish needs to swim. Some of us are just naturally inquisitive and going after pushing the envelope, understanding, better treatments for our patients. And there are opportunities at all levels, students, residents, fellows, and faculty to be involved in clinical research. So what's cooking in the CCRC right now? We do have an ongoing study of intravenous peramivir for infants less than 2 years old with the flu. So if you get anybody with the flu less than 2, please call us. We're studying the natural history of neonatal HSV disease, and I know there's one patient on the floor that we may enroll shortly related to this study. We're studying the pharmacokinetics of ganciclovir in preemies with CMV disease. On the drawing board, and hopefully within the next few months, we'll be on a phase 2-3 clinical trial studying a Prevnar 20 formulation compared to Prevnar 13, which is the current standard of care for infants. And our treatment study of RSV with lumicitabine, phase 2-3 clinical trial, should be on board within the next couple of months. This is the drug we've studied over the past couple of years in the phase 1 trial, pharmacokinetics, and been very successful. In fact, we're the only site in North America to enroll anybody this year, and we enrolled 3 subjects in this trial. So it just closed a couple of days ago. All right, so with that, always the political reminder, when it's budget cutting time, they always start with the easiest targets. Keep track of the media, keep watching Congress, keep watching our state legislature. There's a lot of things in play. Don't be afraid to get involved, and if you're nervous about it, call me because I'm up to my ears. All right, any questions about clinical trials, clinical research? Easy peasy. All right, several of you are presenting posters at SSPR. If you want to talk about designing posters and making those effective presentations, come by afterwards and we'll chat for a few minutes on the chalkboard. With that, thank you.